Two people, same age, same city, same $80,000 saved after years of the same unglamorous discipline, canceled subscriptions, generic cereal, the whole routine, financially identical. One of them buys a house, the other keeps renting and invests the difference instead. 20 years later, the gap between them has nothing to do with who made the smarter choice on day one, and almost everything to do with what happened after that first decision, month after month, for 2 decades straight. My name is EcoSticker, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, the hidden psychological traps of wealth building, and why renting is throwing money away gets repeated so often that it stopped sounding like a claim and started sounding like a fact. If you want the actual math, not the slogan, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if it ends up changing how you think about one of the biggest financial decisions most people ever make. Here's the reframe worth sitting with before any numbers show up. Renters pay rent, homeowners pay mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and a pile of closing costs on the way in. Calling one of those throwing money away while treating the other as pure investment isn't really math. It's a slogan that happens to sound like math, and it falls apart the moment you actually look at where a mortgage payment goes in the early years. Let's build this out properly using two people who start in the exact same financial position and make two completely different choices. Person A finds a home after months of searching. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small backyard, a garage that will mostly store things he doesn't use. The home costs $350,000. He puts down $70,000, a full 20%, leaving a $280,000 mortgage. But the down payment isn't the whole entry cost. Closing costs, lender fees, title fees, inspections, and prepaid taxes typically run somewhere between 2% and 5% of the purchase price. So on a $350,000 home, that's realistically another $7,000 to $17,500 before he's even moved in. Let's assume $10,000 for this comparison. That means his entire $80,000 in savings is gone before he unpacks a single box, $70,000 into the down payment, $10,000 into closing costs. He takes a 30-year fixed mortgage at 7%. Principal and interest alone runs about $1,863 a month. Add roughly $350 in property taxes, $150 in insurance, and a maintenance reserve of about $290 a month, roughly 1% of the home's value annually, and his total monthly housing cost lands around $2,650. Person B, meanwhile, rents a comparable home nearby for $2,000 a month. No property taxes, no insurance premium, and if the water heater fails, that's the landlord's problem entirely. That leaves an extra $650 a month compared to person A's total housing cost. Instead of letting that difference quietly evaporate into lifestyle creep, person B takes the full $80,000 that would have gone toward a down payment and invests it in a broad index fund, then adds that monthly $650 difference to the same investment every single month going forward. Now here's where the rent is wasted, mortgage builds equity claim actually gets tested against real numbers. In person A's very first month, roughly $1,633 of his payment is mortgage interest, plus $350 in taxes, $150 in insurance, $290 in maintenance reserve, out of his full $2,650 monthly cost. Only about $230 actually builds equity that first month. The other $2,420 is simply the cost of housing. Functionally, no different in kind from rent, just packaged differently. Fast forward 3 years. Person A has made 36 payments and paid down just over $9,000 of principal, bringing his mortgage balance to roughly $271,000. Assuming 3 to 4% annual appreciation, a fairly standard long-run assumption, the home is now worth somewhere between $382,000 and $394,000, leaving him with roughly $112,000 to $123,000 in home equity. That's real, meaningful wealth. Person B has paid $72,000 in rent over that same stretch, money that's genuinely gone. But his original $80,000, invested at a 10% average annual return, has grown to roughly $106,000 on its own. Add in 3 years of monthly contributions and their growth, and his total portfolio sits around $130,000. So after 3 years, the two outcomes are surprisingly close. Person A has built substantial equity locked inside a physical asset. Person B has built a substantial liquid portfolio he can access without selling anything or asking a bank's permission. Here's where the picture starts shifting. Person A's principal and interest payment stays fixed for the entire 30 years, but his total housing cost doesn't stay flat. Property taxes rise as the home appreciates, insurance premiums creep upward, and repair bills tend to get more ambitious as the house ages. Person B's cost grows too, but in a different way. Rent typically climbs a few percent annually. Starting at $2,000, a 3% annual increase means that $650 monthly advantage he started with slowly erodes over time as rent creeps toward and eventually past what Person A pays in principal and interest alone. By year 10, Person A's home, still appreciating in that 3 to 4% range, is worth somewhere between $470,000 and $518,000. His remaining mortgage balance has fallen to around $240,000, leaving him with $230,000 to $278,000 in equity. He's paid for a decade of maintenance and repairs along the way, some of which genuinely improved the property, some of which simply kept entropy at bay. Person B's original $80,000 alone, compounding at 10% annually for a decade, is now worth roughly $207,000. Factor in 10 years of monthly contributions, shrinking gradually as rent climbed, plus their own growth, and his total portfolio lands around $290,000. He's still ahead on liquid net worth, but his rent has climbed from $2,000 toward roughly $2,700 a month, closing in on Person A's fixed $1,863 principal and interest payment. Jump to year 20. Both are now in their 50s. Person A's home is worth somewhere between $632,000 and $767,000. His mortgage balance has dropped to around $160,000, leaving equity somewhere between $472,000 and $607,000. Person B's original $80,000 alone has grown to roughly $538,000 at that same 10% average return. And with 2 decades of monthly contributions layered on top, his total portfolio is now around $750,000. On pure net worth, Person B comes out ahead, but the composition of that wealth looks very different. His entire portfolio is liquid, sellable in pieces whenever needed. Person A can't sell 8% of his kitchen to cover an emergency. His wealth is real, but it's locked inside a single illiquid asset. And Person B's rent, after 2 decades of steady increases, now sits around $3,600 a month, a cost with no finish line, while Person A has only 10 years left before his mortgage disappears entirely, and his housing cost drops to just taxes, insurance, and maintenance. But here's the condition buried inside Person B's entire result, and it's the one most people quietly skip when they run this comparison in their head. He actually had to invest that difference every single month, for 20 straight years. When markets dropped 30% in a bad year, he had to keep investing anyway. When financial headlines were predicting the end of the world for the 4th time that decade, he had to keep investing anyway. The spreadsheet assumes perfect discipline. Real people often don't have it. That monthly difference quietly becomes a nicer car, a few extra vacations, a slightly upgraded lifestyle, and years later, the portfolio that looked fantastic on paper never actually existed outside of it. A mortgage, by contrast, creates a kind of forced savings mechanism. Person A never had to decide, month after month, whether he felt like building equity that particular week. The bank already made that decision for him, automatically and behaviorally. That difference matters enormously in the real world, even if it doesn't show up anywhere in a spreadsheet formula. There's a psychological layer here too, separate from the discipline question, that the pure numbers never capture. Home ownership carries an emotional weight that renting simply doesn't, for better and worse. Person A can paint a wall without asking permission, plant something in the backyard and watch it actually mature over years, instead of wondering if he'll be there to see it. Put a nail in a wall without a lease clause, silently judging him for it. That sense of permanence has genuine psychological value, even though it never appears as a line item in any of the math above. Person B carries the opposite advantage, the freedom to leave a bad situation, a bad landlord, a neighborhood that stopped fitting his life, without the multi-month process of listing, showing, and closing on a property first. Neither of these emotional realities shows up on a balance sheet, but pretending they don't factor into real decisions made by real people would be its own kind of dishonesty. But buying carries its own structural weaknesses, separate from both the raw numbers and the emotional ones. The first is time. If person A had sold after only 3 years, closing costs going in, selling costs coming out, and the interest-heavy structure of early mortgage payments could easily have wiped out most or all of his advantage. Buying generally needs real time, often 7 to 10 years or more, for the math to actually work in your favor. The second weakness is mobility, and it's worth actually running the numbers on rather than just gesturing at it. Imagine both people get an excellent job offer in another state exactly 8 years in. Person B's decision is simple. Give notice, pack, leave, and his entire portfolio moves with him without friction. Person A faces a harder choice. Selling means paying roughly 6% in agent commissions plus closing costs, potentially $25,000 to $30,000 off a home worth around $445,000 at that point, on top of the time and uncertainty of finding a buyer. Renting the property out instead means becoming a long-distance landlord, carrying a mortgage in one city while paying rent in another, hoping a tenant covers most or all of the costs, and personally absorbing any month the property sits vacant or the tenant doesn't pay. Either path costs him something real that person B simply doesn't have to think about. There's also concentration risk. Person B owns a diversified slice of thousands of companies. Person A owns exactly one house on one street in one specific local economy. If that local market outperforms, he benefits enormously. If it struggles, there's no rebalancing away from a struggling neighborhood the way there's rebalancing away from a struggling sector in a diversified portfolio. And finally, liquidity. If person B suddenly needs $20,000, he sells a slice of his portfolio and it's done within days. If person A needs $20,000, his options are refinancing, borrowing against equity, or selling the entire property. Home equity is genuine wealth, but it's remarkably inconvenient to actually spend. So which one is actually better? The honest answer is that it depends on two questions, not one universal rule. First, how long are you actually staying? Buying rewards a long time horizon, roughly 7 to 10 years or more, because that's how long it typically takes to absorb the upfront transaction costs and let fixed payments start outpacing rising rents. Sell too early, and those upfront costs alone can erase most of the advantage before it ever had a chance to build. Second, will you genuinely invest the difference? Because the entire renting and investing strategy only works if the and investing part actually happens consistently for years, including during the exact market downturns when investing feels hardest to justify. If that discipline doesn't hold, the theoretical advantage simply evaporates into everyday spending, and renting stops being a wealth-building strategy and just becomes, well, renting. One rough tool for sizing this up: the price-to-rent ratio, dividing a home's price by the annual rent of a comparable property. A $350,000 home against $24,000 in annual rent works out to a ratio around 14.6. As that ratio climbs, particularly above roughly 20, renting tends to become the more competitive option, though mortgage rates, taxes, insurance, and expected investment returns all still matter alongside it. So here's where you actually stand now. You know that a mortgage payment in the early years is mostly interest, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, not equity, which means the rent is wasted, buying is investing. Framing is genuinely misleading in the short run. You know that buying's real advantage depends heavily on staying long enough to absorb the upfront costs, typically 7 to 10 years or more, and that a mid-course move can quietly erase years of advantage through selling costs alone. You know that renting's advantage depends entirely on actually investing the difference with real discipline, not just theoretically having the option to. And you know that both paths trade specific things for other things: stability, leverage, forced savings, and a sense of permanence on one side, flexibility, liquidity, diversification, and freedom of movement on the other. Neither choice is automatically smart, and neither is automatically a mistake. The real decision isn't renting versus buying in the abstract. It's whether you're actually going to stay long enough for buying to pay off, and whether you're actually going to invest consistently enough for renting to pay off. Because 20 years later, the difference was never really about which box got checked on day one. It was about what happened quietly every single month for the 2 decades after that.